I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the renewable energy revolution that's happening around the world and look at where Queensland needs to go and also some of the barriers that exist in Queensland and federally and local government levels as well. The technologies that you see on the screen in front of you are the leading technologies in renewable energy. They're leading the revolution that is happening around the world. They consist of wind farms, the cheapest way to generate new electricity, solar PV, the one on the bottom right, which is now being implemented on a very large scale, very cheaply as well. Hydro systems on the top right, and also solar thermal electric or concentrating power on the top left there. These technologies are going through a revolutionary stage of implementation. Typically growth rates annually of 25% per year with these technologies. What's the global context with renewables? 2015, 173 countries with renewable energy targets, often 50% or more renewable energy target for their electricity. About 24% of all electricity now around the world is coming from renewables, and there's been a massive increase in investment in renewable energy. There's more investment in renewable energy electricity now than there is in fossil fuels. About 20% of all total end-use energy comes now from renewable energy globally. That's actually an underestimate because there's a number of uses of renewable energy which simply don't get counted in the statistics. For example, salt drying or crop drying. There's about over 8 million jobs, both directly and indirectly. And countries like Germany have very aggressive strategies in place to transfer their economies. Currently they're generating about 30% of their electricity from renewables. They've created about 400,000 jobs, a huge export industry, and they've got a very big target. One is to ramp up their renewable energy progressively until it's about 80% of their electricity generation by 2050, and at the same time halve their total energy use. Now this is a country that is far more energy efficient than Australia, and they're still planning on a further 50% reduction in their energy use. What's required in Queensland? Well, currently this is where Queensland is. We've got about 2,300 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, providing about 4,400 gigawatt hours of electricity. That's about 9.5% of all end-use electricity. These numbers are a little bit higher than government statistics because they include solar water heating as a contributor towards that, and also they're based on a percentage of end-use energy use, not generation. We need to get to this level of capacity if the state government is to reach its target of 50% electricity generation from renewables by 2030. We need about another 6,000 to 7,000 megawatts of capacity to generate about 29,000 gigawatt hours. So that would ramp us up to about 50% electricity generation. That would be pretty much in line with trying to keep global warming under 2 degrees. If we want to achieve 1.5 degrees, we've got to be even more aggressive than that. And we can do that certainly with energy efficiency coming into the equation. That would create investment of somewhere between 10 and 19 billion dollars. It depends on the price of the technologies, but all the costs are coming down in all these technologies. Fossil fuel costs are all going up the other way. It would generate about 18,000 full-time job equivalents. So that basically replaces the number of jobs roughly that we see now in the coal industry in Queensland. Communities right across Australia are now being confronted with the rapid expansion of coal seam gas and also more coal mining. And I worked with one in the Felton Valley farmers up in the Darling Downs to stop a coal mine from going ahead in 2010. What was planned there was an open cut coal mine and a massive petrochemical plant, both very polluting and both very greenhouse intensive. They were planned to use dirty coal, poor quality coal, to produce diesel fuel, supposedly a clean diesel fuel. clean fossil fuel is an oxymoron. So let's move on. What the farmers are looking for are alternatives. They need a diversified income to help them through dry periods, droughts for example, and we can do that by farming the poorer quality soils in their farms with either solar farms or wind farms or a combination. We have that potential to do that. I'm going to go through now and just paint for you the picture of just how much the external costs, the social and environmental costs of fossil fuels are now costing society, both in Australia and globally, and also the subsidies that these industries still receive. This is chronologically. External costs, 2007 CSIRO identifies air pollution and health costs and also damage to property and materials at about $3 to $5 billion per year. 2009, the Academy of Technology, Science and Engineering does a major study on the hidden costs of electricity and identifies about $40 per megawatt hour. In Queensland, that translates to about $1.2 billion cost each year. A Harvard University study, very in-depth study of external costs of fossil fuels, came up with a figure of $200 per megawatt hour. That's probably a bit high for Queensland, but if you translate that into Queensland's power generation from coal, it's about $6 billion per year. The disaster costs are going up each year at about 3.5%, and in 2011 they are estimated at about $6.3 billion. A major study by a group called Climate and Health Alliance in 2011 in the Hunter Valley identified that the social costs of carbon from that area globally would be between $16 and $66 billion. This industry receives huge subsidies. Why are we subsidising industries which make huge profits and are mature? Typically, they've been receiving about $8 to $12 billion in federal government subsidies each year. Both my own work back in 2012 and the work of the Australian Institute identified that about $1 to $2 billion of state government money goes to the fossil fuel industry to assist its development each year in Queensland. The IMF has identified that global subsidies, mostly to fossil fuels, are in the order of $5.3 trillion in 2015. And of course, this is the ugly face of climate change that we need to address. We have two pathways forward. The one on the left is the renewable energy pathway, currently providing about 20% of energy across the world. The one on the right is the fossil fuel or nuclear pathway, which leads to continuous pollutants into the environment and to pollutants that we have to deal with not just for 10 years or 50 years, but for thousands of years. This is something that no civilization has ever asked of its descendants. So we need to think, which of these pathways do we want to go down? Let's look at some barriers. Firstly, we need to address the fundamentals of the national electricity market. At the moment, it does not encourage the uptake of renewable energy. It is a barrier to it. It needs to have its fundamental objectives redefined. And the work of groups like Solar Citizens and Get Up put together a fantastic homegrown energy plan. I encourage you all to go on the web and have a look at it. It really helps to identify what needs to happen to address this transition to renewable energy. The state government needs to look at redefining the uses of leasehold land, particularly when we're looking at land that's currently being leased and it has a particular usage that's been specified for it, and now we want to include renewable energy. That's not written into the use of that land at the moment. So we need to look at both the scale of the renewable energy that may be going onto that land and also the timelines involved to modify the rules and regulations to allow that to happen. Local government needs to be consistent in the rules for subdivisions, particularly for minimum lots. For example, some regional government, local government, have a minimum size of 2,000 hectares that you have to basically purchase or lease. That is too much land for some of the developers to consider either buying outright or having to lease. So we need consistency across the state in what constitutes a reasonable minimum lot size that will assist the development of the renewable energy industry. There are some conflicts that we need to consider and disparities. The mining industry has incredible rights. They have rights over virtually everything, including land rights. And the renewable energy industry doesn't have anywhere near those rights. So there is a very big disparity between what the miners can do and what access the renewable energy industry is going to have. Now, there's a big difference between renewable energy and mining. You can remove the renewable energy technology 20 years down the track if you're not happy with it, and the land is not stuffed. Now, in Queensland at the moment, we have 15,000 abandoned mine sites which have never been properly rehabilitated, with a cost of many billions of dollars if that's going to happen. That doesn't happen when you roll out large-scale renewables. You can take it away down the track. If there are other alternatives that come up, you've still got the land to use that down the track. We need to be very careful about looking at the vegetation laws that are being proposed, because there may be some issues where they're overly restrictive to the uptake of renewables. For example, if there are patches of remnant forest or particular landforms, and the renewable energy scheme has to work around that, it means the total area of land that they may have available for a particular scheme will reduce, and that may reduce the cost effectiveness on that particular area. So there needs to be some consultation with the renewable energy industry in relation to the proposed vegetation laws. And we need to look at preserving good quality ag land. Australia has about 4% of its land mass, which is both good quality soil and relatively reliable rainfall, 4%. So the Redlands where I live, all good farming country, all gone under housing, largely poor quality suburbia in many cases. We really need to look at preserving that land, and if the renewables are going to go onto that land, make sure they're not being put on the best quality soils, so that we get that land for food production. I'll just have a look now for small-scale renewables. There's a number of issues here. One is that we need to firm up the laws in relation to solar and wind access. And I'll just show you some examples in a moment. We need some national fair tariffs for feeding in power to the grid system, and the ability basically to trade our power. There's this concept now of virtual power stations, where 1,000 people with small power systems may join together to actually bid their power onto the network as a virtual power system. If we look at the feed-in tariffs, we have some Neanderthal people currently reviewing electricity prices in Queensland. It's called the Queensland Competition Authority. And there's another group called the Queensland Productivity Commission, and they're not doing much of a better job either. Both these groups have basically come out with very, very poor costings on the real value of solar. They're saying that it's worth something like about 6.5 to 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour. It's much more than that. This is a study done, a comprehensive study done in Florida, same climate as here, most of the same factors apply. They came up with 33.7 cents is what I should be paid for my power if it's fed into the electricity network. A big difference between 6.5 that the economic so-called rationalists want to provide us with 33. And we need better consumer protection as well, because there's been a lot of dodgy players in the solar market, partly because of the boom and bust cycles that have been brought about through poor government policy over the last 15 years or so. Just going to give some examples of poor planning. This is a housing in what we call urban consolidation around Wellington Point, where I live. It's close to the station. They're trying to cram more and more houses in to get higher population density there. This house down here, you see that's actually got a solar water heater on it. This new house here now shades that solar water heater for about all of winter, basically. When you need the hot water the most? Middle of winter. Sorry, I'll just go back on. this house here is actually a new house built by a major developer, and they've positioned it right along the fence line where all of these trees substantially shade both the solar PV system and the solar water heater very, very significantly in winter. Only in summer would that get really clear performance. They actually advertise the house as being cheaper to run because it's got a solar hot water system and PV system, and then they put it in a position where it gets heavy shade. It doesn't make much sense. Here's two houses that, examples of houses which are crammed close together. We actually want some winter gain, solar gain we call it, into our houses for 3 months of the year in Brisbane. We don't want to exclude it. The building regulations currently don't enforce it well enough, and here's an example where the lower story of this house, that's actually winter sunlight on the top level here, but it doesn't get down to the bottom level. The bottom level is equally as important. So all these windows, A, they don't get winter sun to help warm the house, which is free energy, and B, they don't get much natural lighting. Similar thing is happening here. This has got a shading device over the window. They're screening it from the neighbours' windows because they're so close together. That's restricting both sunlight entry if it's on the right side of the house. It's also restricting natural light, both of which are then pushing up energy costs. And this is a dispute that I was involved in as a technical expert, where these houses along here complained about the trees in this yard, owned by this house in here, which was built about 30 years before these houses. And because the developer didn't do the subdivision very well, he crammed all the houses right back on the blocks. He put the swimming pools right at the back. Of course, that roofs are shaded and the swimming pools get lots of leafy matter in them. And these people then complained and took it through QCAT to basically badger this poor woman in this house to cut all the trees down, trim them back. She actually took out 10 trees at the cost of about $18,000 to her and pruned them well back. They still complained. She fortunately won the court case, or the battle through QCAT. These people were basically saying we can't use solar power in our houses. The fault fundamentally lay with the subdivision. The houses were too big and should have been brought right up close to the street. No reason why they couldn't have done that. I want to just address a couple of big picture issues before I finish. Hopefully I'm not too much over time. One is that greenhouse gas emissions, this is a breakdown of per capita greenhouse gas emissions. This area here, the blue and the yellow, are our day-to-day emissions, which we can all address work through energy efficiency, PVs on our roofs, and electric cars, for example. But all of this around here, this other area, is all the services that we're provided with, goods and services, which has embodied energy and greenhouse gas emissions. That is where both government and industry have to pull their weight. The policy of government for many years, particularly under Conservative governments, has been to put the pressure on the individual, not on the big companies. And they need to act. So does government. Get their house in order. The rich also need to act. If we look at their emissions, this is on the right-hand side, they're both direct and embodied energy usage and associated emissions. That's for the rich on the harbour side in Sydney, and that's the poor down there in the western suburbs of Sydney. So if you're richer, you've got much more wealth invested in embodied energy, in other houses, in yachts and whatever, and that's all causing emissions as well. And last but not least, we need to think about why are we in the Middle East and potentially now in the South China Sea defending oil. The real cost of oil calculated by the Rocky Mountain Institute back in the 1990s was actually $450 a barrel. When you took into consideration all of the costs of fighting those wars, we continue to do it. What have we learned? We need to take a major leap forward. All the technologies are now in place to do it. We need to bring down the barriers, put the incentives in place, and let's get Queensland leaping forward to become a real sunshine state. Thank you.